My name is Father Alex Lashchuk. I'm the interim director of the Sheptytsky Institute here at St. Paul University. It's great to see so many people out. When you're doing an event like this and you have to know how much coffee and how much water to order a month ago, it's sometimes difficult. So I hope our Lord works some miracles. He's creating the wine out of the water. So we have with us tonight Father Bob Wild. Father Robert was born in 1936 in Buffalo, New York, of a very good, he says a good, but I say a very good Catholic family, accompanied by a twin sister. And he was ordained for the diocese in 1967. And before that spent 2 years as a Trappist in New York State, and then 2 years as a Carthusian in Sussex, England. After 4 years of parish life, he joined Madonna House in 1971 and was allowed to live the Postinic way of life for many years. During that time, he edited a number of Catherine's books, and in 1990 became postulator for her cause for canonization. He's written a trilogy on her spirituality and is guest master at the Madonna House Clergy Retreat House in Cumbamere, and continues to write, giving retreats and giving spiritual direction. So, Father Robert, we welcome you.
So after that short biography, I tell people I'm writing a book on stability. Actually, I believe if you are trying to follow the Lord's plan for you, often it takes you in different ways, but there's a divine consistency to our pilgrimages, I think. There's probably a great variety of knowledge of Catherine in the audience. Some of you may not know much about her at all. And some maybe a great deal, and maybe everything in between. On one of the tables out there, there's quite a bit of literature available for the taking that will give you an idea of different aspects of Catherine's life. But for my talk this evening, which as you know, the title is Servant of God, Catherine to Hueck Doherty, a bridge between East and West. So in order to highlight that theme, I'll be picking certain things out of her life pilgrimage that I think will give you, those who are not familiar with her, give you a good idea of her life. For the rest, there's books and things available on the internet. My talk this evening is not so much about how we can also become bridges between East and West, generally Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. But it's going to be more about how Catherine herself, through the providence of God, became a bridge through her life experiences. So the concentration is more on how she herself, through God's providence, through background, etc., how she herself became a bridge between these two great traditions. Let me begin with a quote from one of Catherine's letters. She used to write letters to the community, and we have a number of volumes of collections of those letters. In 1967, she wrote a rather long letter about the Eastern dimension of Madonna House. But at the beginning of this letter, she wrote this: "What my heart desires is unity, reunion, or whatever you want to give it." And then she uses the expression, "my family school." And we'll be talking about that quite a bit, how in her family life at an early age, she learned about these two great traditions. She said, "My family school, if I may put it this way, made me a sort of bridge, evidently, even before I knew the depth and the heights of the split between East and West. I knew in the depth of my heart that unimportant as I was, a simple refugee from Russia, I too had a share in the healing of this division. And how it was to be healed, I did not know, except perhaps by trying to live my Eastern spirituality and sharing whatever I could with my fellow Roman Catholics. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the phrase that Pope John Paul often used about breathing with the two lungs of the East and the West. I believe the phrase actually comes from the Russian poet Ivanov. He used to read Russian, and I think he got that phrase from this Russian poet. But in the Pope's book, Memory and Identity, he wrote, "Just as a healthy organism needs two lungs to breathe properly, so too the Church, as a spiritual organism, needs these two traditions in order to attain more fully the riches of revelation." And one of the members of the Madonna House, when he went over this talk, he said that biologically, you can live with one lung, but you can't run. And I thought that would apply in a good sense to our living fully the Christian tradition. We can live, but we can't run with only one lung. And in the Pope's encyclical Unum Sint, John Paul briefly referred to the celebration of the millennium of the baptism of Rus, and then said, "In this perspective, an expression which I have frequently employed finds its deepest meaning." He says the Church must breathe with her two lungs. And that's an added emphasis, that the Church must breathe with her two lungs. And so these two lungs, the image, will be my major theme for this presentation this evening about Catherine. Just as Catherine is a teacher in the ways of prayer and poverty and social justice, so in her writings and in her life, she can also teach us, you might say, how to become bridges ourselves, how at least to begin breathing with these two lungs. Now probably, the acquisition of these two lungs is not a priority for most Christians, East or West. I presume, perhaps for most of you here, that's maybe why you're here this evening. But I know before I came to Madonna House, I had nothing in the seminary, nothing in the diocese about the Eastern Church. It was just not part of the radar system. And so my hope is that in this presentation about Catherine as a bridge, it might be a stimulus for us to try and learn more about this other dimension of our Christian tradition. And the personal fact of Catherine's life that I will be concentrating on, and I ask you to keep in mind during my talk this evening, is that from her very earliest years, probably even before she was, aware of whatever, from her earliest years, she breathed with the two lungs of the East and the West. And that's what I'm going to try and explain to you this evening. From her earliest years as a child, growing up in Russia, she was already breathing with these two lungs. So first I will give a partial explanation of the origin of these lungs in Catherine's early formation. And then I'll present some experiences in her life pilgrimage that helped to expand these lungs in her own life. And then I hope to justify in some small way my calling her as one of the bridges in our times between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, or even more generally, basically between Western and Eastern Christians, because Christians from all different churches in our world today are reading and learning from her teachings. So first of all, about her family background. Catherine's father, Theodore, was born in Warsaw, Poland, when the country was tragically partitioned by Germany, Austria, and Russia. Warsaw, as you may know, was in the Russian part. And Catherine's grandfather, married a fairly wealthy Polish lady who was a Catholic. This is in occupied Poland. And in a letter to her son, George, Catherine's son George, in 1975, when her son was doing all kind of historical research into his own family and her family background, she wrote, "Yes, my father was secretly baptized, a Roman Catholic, because grandfather promised his Polish wife that their first child, boy or girl, would so be baptized. But officially, he, the son, was a member of the Russian Orthodox Church." Now, we of the community, there's several other community members here, we often heard Catherine say that her father was Catholic. She never went into it, and we were kind of maybe hesitant to ask her. But I believe what she wrote to her son is the origin of that understanding. And she could have only gotten it from her father or another member of the family. But she always said that her father was Catholic. Now, such a baptism would have been illegal in Poland at that time. And so there would be no documentation. But a Polish friend of ours in the Combermere area, she went to Warsaw and did some research. She found the father's birth certificate, but there was no religion marked on it. So we know the year he was born, but there was nothing, again, because it would have been illegal to have him baptized in that way. The same Polish friend who did this research is of the opinion that because of the family name of Catherine's grandmother, Lizetki was, and the fact that the family was from eastern Poland, she says they might have been Uniate Catholics and not Romans. According to one historian, with the first partition of Poland in 1772, Catherine the Great gained a sizable amount of territory and nearly 1 million Catholics. Out of a total population of 1,800,000, about 800,000 were Belarusian Uniates. Catherine said that she learned a lot about the Catholic Church from summer visits that she used to make to her grandmother in Poland. And at one time, her grandmother lived near them in Kennerymaslav. Now, when her father's family moved back to Russia from Poland, he would have practiced Orthodoxy as a member of the Orthodox Church. But it's my own opinion, we don't have any documentation about this, it's my own opinion that because he was born in Poland and could speak Polish, it's very possible that the family had some kind of contact with the Polish Uniates. There were several 100,000 Polish Uniates who had been deported there because of the resistance to the occupation. So that's just my conjecture that her father could possibly have kept up some contact with the Catholic Poles and Russian. Catherine herself was baptized in the family home in St. Petersburg by an Orthodox priest in 1896, a couple weeks after her birth on August 2nd, the date 13 years different from the Western Gregorian calendar. Now, I'm sure most of you know that the Orthodox Church, especially in those days, was not big on catechism in our sense of the word. Children, and adults as well, they learn the faith through the liturgy, home customs, pilgrimages, religious experiences. And this is how Catherine, very early in her life, had her own Orthodox lung inflated. The best book of Catherine's to read about her Orthodox formation, it's on sale outside on the book table, is called My Russian Yesterdays, where she beautifully recounts her experiences of Russian Orthodoxy. Especially moving is her account of Easter night, when all the bells of the city would be rung. And they had some big bells in those days. And they would carry the sacred fire through the snow-covered streets to their home. She recounts the pilgrims who often visited their home, telling their stories while warming themselves at the fire and being served a hot drink. And in her book, Not Without Parables, she recounts many of these inspiring tales told by the pilgrims. But what is interesting about this book, My Russian Yesterdays, is her use of Catholic language. For example, in the chapter on pilgrimages in Russia, this is a quote from this book, pilgrimages in Russia, masses, matins and lauds, the little hours of the Blessed Virgin Mary, vespers, compline, several masses a day. This is all kind of Catholic language. And she never in that book uses the word divine liturgy or orthodoxy. But she speaks of the Eastern Rite, and the book, you may be interested to know, is dedicated to Our Lady of Fatima, a book on my Russian yesterdays, dedicated to Our Lady of Fatima. Now, perhaps this was to help her Western audience make some connections, but it's interesting, especially if you keep in mind this possible connection of the family with Polish Uniates that were living in Russia at the time. What about her mother's influence in forming these two lungs? Well, ethnically, her mother was Scottish-English, one of those families that Peter the Great brought in to westernize the country. And her passport always said Lutheran. But I believe that she was very ecumenical at heart. After they had to flee the country because of the revolution, they lived in Belgium. And I had an interview with her son, Andre, who visited Madonna House several times. And he told me that when they lived in Belgium, his mother would go to different churches. It didn't seem to matter to her too much, so she was quite ecumenical in her actual practice. Of course, from her mother, Catherine learned the practical things, how to organize a large home, how to organize Madonna House. And Catherine used to go with her mother to villages in that movement. It was called Going to the People, trying to lessen the gap between the wealthy and the poor. And she often went on these apostolates to poor villages, cleaning, nursing, doing ordinary things. So her mother was very instrumental in teaching her about the presence of Christ in the poor. So what about her Catholic formation? In the year 1903, the father moved the family to Egypt because of his work. And there, Catherine was put into a Catholic school run by the Sisters of Zion. I'm not sure about this, but I wonder if any absolute Russian Orthodox father would have put his child in a Catholic school during the most formative years of her young life. Maybe. Maybe there weren't any other schools around. But still, these are the most formative years of a young child's life. But I believe he could have been motivated by the Catholicism that was part of his own background. And he wanted his daughter to know something of this aspect of her Christian life. So she was in this school for 4 or 5 years and absorbing the whole Catholic devotional life and teaching, Catholic catechism as well, that we were always insistent on doing. So this school, I believe, was really the foundational nourishment of her Catholic lung. Later on in life, when she recalls some of her most significant graces, for example, her great love for priests, her first meeting with St. Francis, her desire to comfort Christ in his suffering. One day she went around the school taking Christ off of the crucifix to reduce his sufferings. These experiences that were very fundamental for her, they always come from this Catholic school, which I think also is extremely significant. The experience was so powerful that after about 5 or 6 years, she wanted even then to become a Catholic. And the father moved, and one of the reasons for the moving, we believe, was to remove her from this Catholic environment. Thus, her Orthodox religious and cultural formation and the years she spent in this Catholic school were the early beginnings of her two lungs. And so that's why I said at the beginning, even as a young child, she had these two traditions that she was learning by osmosis, or more formal education. Probably most of you know of what was called the Bloody or Red Sunday in Russia in 1905, when it was this great peaceful demonstration, but the Tsarist troops fired on the people. Terrible, terrible tragedy. But as a result of this, and I quote from a historical study, quote, Tsar Nicholas II was finally obliged to sign the manifesto, which among other concessions allowed his people freedom of worship, of meeting, of association, and equality before the law of all citizens, whatever their religious beliefs or their origins. Before 1905, again, I don't know that much about Russian history, but before 1905, it was illegal for an Orthodox person to convert to the Catholic Church. You had to actually leave the country to do that, and people who were able to leave the country did. But that means that when Theodore brought the family back to Russia in 1910, that during the family's absence, the law had changed and it became possible for an Orthodox person within Russia to become a Catholic. Again, another conjecture of mine that this might have been an added factor in Catherine's movement towards Catholicism. Now her own country recognized the possibility. It's possible, again, just my own conjecture, it's possible that even if she had not fled Russia because of the revolution, she might have become a Catholic in Russia because it was now possible. What were some of the significant intellectual influences in her young life? Perhaps the most important intellectual factor in the formation of Catherine's two lungs was the influence of Vladimir Soloviev. And I'm sure the fathers here and some of the students know who that is, but he's considered by many to be perhaps the greatest Russian. He called himself a religious philosopher. He's considered by many to be the greatest religious philosopher of all time. And in one of the books that's on sale, it's called Catherine's Friends, on the table outside. The first chapter is on Catherine and Soloviev, her relationship to him and his effect on her life. She said that her father used to read Soloviev to them as children. And it's possible that he, the father, attended some of Soloviev's public lectures, which Tolstoy and Dostoevsky also attended. And once in a talk at Madonna House on Soloviev, I listened to the recording, I wasn't there at the time, but she said publicly that she was a product of Soloviev, which is quite a mouthful to say, that she was a product that is formed by this great Russian thinker. In Soloviev's book, Russia and the Universal Church, he proved to his own satisfaction that the whole church had to have a visible head, and that this head was historically the Bishop of Rome, that is, through his own study of the Christian tradition. In the preface of that book, he made a public profession of this headship, and he called, this is about 1885 or something like that, In the preface to this book, he called the Bishop of Rome the wonder-working icon of Christian unity. Can't imagine how unbelievable that would have been for a Russian Orthodox to say such a thing. And another quote from this introduction: I recognize as supreme judge in matters of religion him who has been recognized as such by Saint Irenaeus, Saint Dionysius the Great, Saint Athanasius the Great, Saint John Chrysostom, and these are his own words, and on and on and on. He didn't go through the whole list. Namely, the Apostle Peter, who lives in his successors. A lot has been written about whether or not Soloviev, quote, converted to Catholicism. I think he wouldn't have thought in those terms. He saw recognition of the Bishop of Rome as a compliment that was needed in his own orthodoxy. I know Catherine continued to study Soloviev during her lifetime. We have in our archives in Combermere a complete set in Russian of his correspondence, which I think is quite valuable these days. Soloviev's book on God-manhood, which was the topic of his thesis and topic of his first public lectures, has always been in our library, and that's how I first came in contact with him myself, by looking at this book, God-manhood. She said she kept his books even when she disposed of most of the rest of her library. And his picture is very prominent in our little Russian reading room in Combermere, along with Solzhenitsyn and Tolstoy. So I believe that Soloviev's thinking about Catholicism was a very important factor in Catherine's asking to be admitted to the Catholic Church in London, England, after their escape from Russia in 1919. I have never come across anything in her public speaking or writings that indicated that this was in any way a traumatic experience for her. Having escaped from Russia, she one day came across in London a convent of the nuns who had taught her in Egypt, the Sisters of Zion. In fact, one of her teachers was there. Talk about the providence of God. And believing that she probably would never be able to return to Russia, I believe she now saw her opportunity of fulfilling her early desire of joining the Catholic Church. So she simply knocked on the door and started the proceedings. This step would also have been motivated by a desire to identify with the new world in which she was going to live the rest of her life. We have the reception ceremony of her entrance. And the priest who received her, Father Higgins, he said this, a quote from his little talk at the reception. Pursued by the good Lord from the banks of the Nile, she probably had told him about her schooling, the happy convert, from the banks of the Nile, to the banks of the Thames, the happy convert wished now to work with all her strength for the reunion of the Russian Church with the Roman Church. I'm sure some of you here are familiar with Father Robert Taft. You probably have met him or went to his classes. He taught at the Orientale in Rome. And he was one of the foremost scholars of Eastern and Western liturgies. A few years ago, I interviewed him about Catherine in Rome at the Oriental Institute where he was then teaching. I think he's now retired and living in the United States. He was quite familiar with Catherine. In fact, he said, as a young Jesuit scholastic, when he read my Russian yesterdays, this was one of the things that stirred his early interest in Russia. I asked if he had any comments about her entrance into the Catholic Church. He said, well, the times were different then. There were a number of people in high society Elaine Izwolski, for example, who became Catholic. They were aware of the defects of Russian Orthodoxy, although they probably did not know much about the defects of Catholicism. They were aware, they therefore probably saw Catholicism through rose-colored glasses. These converts probably also saw Catholicism as a bulwark against Catholicism at the time. Or communism should be right. Thank you. That's important. We have to take that out of it. There were several Russian Orthodox bishops, Father continues, at the time, who were even then hoping for a union with Rome. Now, I kind of divide Catherine's later life after she came to Canada in two phases. I call them, just generally speaking, her Catholic phase and her Eastern phase, just for purposes of description. Because all her life, she breathed with these two lungs. They were always in her. But according to the circumstances of her life, they had different times and kinds of expression. After entering the Catholic Church, I believe she had a very strong desire to identify with her new Catholic environment. She was a refugee out of her own country. So she wanted, understandably, desperately to belong. As well, she didn't want to impose her Eastern practices on her growing Catholic relationships. Now, most of the other Russian refugees who retained their Orthodox faith, of course, did not have this interior conflict to contend with. But Catherine, she did not convert out of pure expediency, just because she was now in the West or she wanted to belong. She believed in the teaching of Soloviev and was attracted to the church through her early Catholic formation. In other words, she was a sincere convert. It wasn't a pragmatic decision of any kind. But she suffered for this decision. Many of the Russian refugees in Toronto saw her as a traitor to her country. And actually, it was this kind of nationalism on the part of many of the refugees, this identification of faith and country, that was one of Soloviev's major criticisms of his own orthodoxy. Identifying the two in a way that he thought was contrary to the gospel. Catherine remained a real Russian all her life, but she did not identify her faith with her love for Russia. In this, she would have been quite unique. And neither did she, having been taught by Soloviev, identify her Catholicism either with being a Canadian or an American. She was once asked publicly, and I was there for this, if she considered herself Eastern or Western. She said, neither, Christian. So that's the state that she had arrived at. But I labeled the years in the West from her entrance into the Catholic Church in 1919 until the early 1960s in Cumberland as her Catholic phase. Why? Well, if you read her writings during that period, especially her diaries, which are not really available at this time to many people, in her writings at this period, there's very little reference to things Orthodox. She did help to establish a Russian Orthodox church in Toronto for the immigrants, but to my knowledge, she did not attend any liturgies there. She even got a chalice for them from the Archbishop of Toronto. The people who began joining her in her apostolate for the poor were Catholic. She was under the Catholic bishops in her apostolic life. She became a Third Order Franciscan. She always had Catholic spiritual directors. And of course, all this while, she was learning about Catholicism, no longer as a child, but as a practicing adult. It was her own adult Catholic formation period, her personal existential RCIA program. But she kept some Orthodox practices. She used to bow before the Blessed Sacrament instead of genuflecting. making the sign of the cross in the Orthodox fashion. And when she lived in Harlem, she went on occasion to the Russian Catholic Church in New York City. But for all ostensible purposes, she would have appeared to anyone as a good Catholic woman with some strange behavior. She subscribed to some Russian magazines about Orthodoxy in North America. But her devotional life was pretty much Catholic. Daily Mass, Stations of the Cross, the Rosary, Divine Office, and so on. Even in her Eastern phase, which we shall come to shortly, she was always aware that the people joining her apostolate were Catholic, and she was very careful about imposing anything Eastern upon them. In Catherine's first book, Friendship House, published by Sheen and Ward in 1946, the last chapter was entitled, The Men in My Life. It's about her favorite male saints and how she first met them. She lists, at that time, Blessed Martin de Porres, St. Francis, St. Ignatius, St. Augustine, St. John Bosco, and St. Thomas Aquinas. And she wrote, "What girl can produce a better list? I love them all." But I simply point out that there are no Russian or Orthodox saints mentioned in this book. There's no St. Sergius, no Seraphim of Zarov. Now, needless to say, Catholic readers in 1946 would not have known anyhow who these Russian saints were. But I would say that all her life, Catherine had a greater personal love and devotion to the Catholic saints more than the Orthodox saints. She was named herself after Catherine of Siena, not after Catherine of Alexandria. And she loved Teresa of Avila. She loved the Little Flower. And as we shall see, she loved the writings of the Russians, but I never sensed a personal love or devotion to, say, Staret Solomon or Seraphim of Zarov, as she had for St. Francis, who was her greatest and earliest love among the saints. So that's her Catholic Western phase. What about the phase of her Eastern love? After Vatican II was announced, and before it got underway, Catherine thought that what the council most needed was prayer. I remember someone meeting on the street at that time, the great Abraham Heschel. Some of you may be familiar with him, the great Jewish rabbi. And they met him on the street, and he was quite disturbed about the council. He said, "They're not praying enough." And so Catherine's mind went back into her Russian Orthodox roots and came up with the tradition of the pustinia, the Russian word for the desert. It's a name she gave to a small cabin or a room where people go for a day of prayer and fasting. I wasn't there at the time, but the whole community made a pilgrimage. It's about 3 miles to an old farmhouse that became the first pustinia in North America. And when Catherine wrote Thomas Merton about her pustinia idea, he wrote back, quote, "I was deeply moved by the pustinia hermitage project. That is ideal. It will be a wonderful contribution. It's the kind of thing that is most needed," in a letter in November 1962. Now, because the pustinia is probably the best known of her Eastern contributions to the West, I will be using it briefly as an example of her unique teaching. She subtitled the book Pustinia, "The Christian Spirituality of the East for a Western Man." And it indicates that she knew in her teachings that she was presenting something of the Eastern tradition to the West. I had the privilege of putting this book together for Catherine. When I had finished the manuscript, I took it over to her cabin, and asked her permission to seek a publisher. She said, "Sure, go ahead. You can try and get it published. You can do anything you want with it, but nobody will publish it. North Americans aren't interested in that sort of thing." Well, God bless Ave Maria Press for being interested in that sort of thing. One famous publisher in the States was not interested. And not only North Americans were interested, but the book has been translated into about 18 languages presently around the world. When the first copy arrived, this is one of my little treasures, this is the first copy. I went into the dining room and presented it to Catherine. And she hardly looked at the book. She came over to me and she took the pen out of my pocket. And she wrote in the book, "To Father Bob Wild, who was wild enough to think that my humble writing could be published, with deep admiration, love, prayer, and gratitude, and total astonishment." That he was right. Love, Catherine de Hueck, Doherty. A few years ago, when I was taking a course for postulators in Rome, I think most of you know I'm a postulator for Catherine's cause, I visited the Oriental Institute. And I had a conversation with the then rector, he may still be the rector, Father Constantine Simon, S.J. He had just finished writing his own book called Russicum, Pioneers and Witnesses of the Struggle for Christian Unity in Eastern Europe. But there was a brief section on some other Russians who had landed in the West. And this is a quote from his book. "A trio of very different Russian Catholic women contributed more than all others to making their cause better known among society at large." He means the cause of unity, working for the unity of the two. He mentions Helene Izwolski. She was a friend of Madonna House, some of you may be familiar with. Irene Poznov, who started a publishing house in France to foster unity between Catholicism and Russia. And Catherine. And after giving a few biographical details about Catherine, he said, quote, "Her book, Pustinia, popularized Russian religious thought in the English-speaking world, perhaps more than any other more learned theological treatise of this century." So, that's quite a mouthful now. He is very much involved in the study of these great traditions. Her book, Pustinia, popularized Russian religious thought in the English-speaking world, perhaps more than any other more learned theological treatise of this century. And so this high praise for Catherine convinced me that she and others who brought the Russian spirituality to the West, even though they did not remain Orthodox, should also be considered as part of the so-called Russian religious renaissance, which we will be considering in a few moments, the Russian religious renaissance. And a second event, which we believe helped to inflate Catherine's Eastern lung at this time, this is the mid-60s, was the arrival one day of Father Joseph Raya. Some of you have met Archbishop Joseph. He had been to Madonna House before, but on this day he brought two icons, I think about 1965. I think. He and one of his parishioners, they marched into the dining room, holding them high in the air. And they were the first icons put on public display in a Madonna House chapel upstairs. We believe, I don't know if she ever made this connection herself, that Catherine took this. She always saw God's will in people and events, things that happened, that God was always coming to her in actual reality. We believe that Catherine took this as a sign that now she could present to the community more of her Eastern roots. These were the first icons in our chapel. The Donna House had had some Eastern liturgies before, celebrated by Catherine's Russian priest friends. It was Father Ledy, Father Rogosh, Father Urosov. But now Father Raya celebrated these liturgies more frequently. And one of our Madonna House priests, Father Francis Martin, some of you may be familiar with Father Francis, he went to Alabama to learn how to celebrate the Eastern rite. And so it's about this time that she began writing about Poustinia to the community. It was some of these letters and other talks that I collected for the book. More Poustinias were built on the grounds of the Donna House, and in subsequent years, her books appeared on many great Orthodox themes, Vornos and Stranik, Eurodivoy, Volchani, and other Eastern themes. And some of those books, especially, again, are on the book table for you this evening, and I would especially recommend those because of the theme that we're thinking about this evening. Now, I want to say something on how I believe the spirituality of these books was primarily developed. I will use Catherine's thinking about Poustinia, as this is probably the book that most people are familiar with. But I want to introduce the way she developed her particular spirituality with these comments. After lunch every day, I never thought it was the best time of day. We used to have spiritual reading. And Catherine would read from a book and then comment on it. Now, some of her most favorite books, ones that she read more than once, were on Russian spirituality or theology. She loved Bishop Anthony Bloom's books on prayer, Star at Siloam, The Undistorted Image, Evdokimov, Struggle with God, as well as sometimes heavier theological books by Schmemann and Leindorf. She read Schmemann's Great Lent almost every year that I was there. So what I want to emphasize is that in these public situations, Catherine is reading Russian literature, Russian theology, and then commenting on the text for her largely Catholic audience. She's reading Russian spirituality and theology, but to communicate her ideas to this particular audience, this is where I believe that this kind of new understanding of many concepts on the spiritual life came into being. They were given birth by this need to translate Russian things to a Western audience. A spirituality was being born which was neither east nor west, but a vision now coming out of her lived Eastern and Western life. She had lived with these. 1965, she would have been close to 70. So she had been living out of these two lungs, but now she was not so much consciously elaborating something new. She was now simply speaking out of her unique experience that had been with her all her life. And because of these icons coming in, she now saw it as a sign from God that now she could start to communicate something from her other Eastern tradition. Her spiritual vision had been germinating for many years in her heart and in her experience, and now she is ready to articulate it. She believes that now she knows how to keep it in a balance with the Catholicism of the community. And no doubt, she had been thinking of how to do this for many years. One of the years when she was reading from the Great Lent, 1972, she paused for a moment and she made this comment, which I think is very relevant to what I just said. I quote, "I talked for many years about these things." She's talking about what she was reading. "But I did not know the background." She didn't know the theological Eastern background or spirituality of these things. And then as I read this, I realized where all these conversations of mine had their beginning. In other words, she was realizing that these books were providing the intellectual framework for what was already in her heart. It's kind of a jumping off point for these new reflections. We have hundreds of hours of these commentaries, and they will be material for many books in the future. Some of the best things we have are these rather spontaneous sharings of her spiritual readings to us. Now I want to give you just one example of this unique spirituality of Catherine's, very briefly. During the years when the spirituality of Justinia was germinating in her mind and heart, she had meetings every Sunday night with a few of us who were at that time living kind of a Justinian way of life, which I was myself at that time. And these talks became part 2 in this book, entitled A Talk to Justiniki. I just want to read you a very brief excerpt, don't have to read very much, and then make a comment. It's in the chapter on kenosis, as you know, the Greek word for empty. She said, during kenosis, discernment reaches a new stage of perfection. It blossoms like a beautiful flower. You discern that you are entering into the mystery of the incarnation. For what did Christ do but empty himself by taking on flesh in the womb of the Virgin? Now you are in the same position he was. He emptied himself to take upon himself the sin of mankind. He emptied himself so that he could atone before the Father for all that needed redemption. He reopened the doors of paradise for us. I would simply say that this and many other of her writings, it's not, you won't find it exactly anywhere in either the East or the West. There's something I believe, we believe, is really new about her teaching. There is something unique about it. I remember at the time reading a review of the book Justinia by a contemporary Russian Orthodox priest. And one of his general criticisms was that, well, it's not really Russian spirituality about the book. My first thought was, well, there's a variety of Russian spiritualities, which one is he referring to? But several of his comments indicated that he didn't think she was Russian at all. For example, he said that her concept of Justinia in the marketplace, if some of you have read that book, it means taking your interior solitude into your workaday world, into the marketplace. He said her concept of Justinia in the marketplace is not Russian. I said to myself, so what? It's a beautiful concept. It's an example of how Catherine could take a Russian practice, spending time alone with the Lord, and apply it to the modern concept of marketplace, taking your interior solitude into the busy world. It's a good example of her blending of East and West. Someday, maybe somebody in the Institute here will do a study of the uniqueness of her spirituality. And so to quote Father Taft again, quote, she might not have been pure Russian in her spirituality because she brought her own experiences to her Russianness. She wouldn't have cared if modern Russians thought she was perfectly Russian or not. That's exactly right. She brought her own experiences to her life with God. She brought her own experiences to her Russianness. And that's the newness of her teaching. I mentioned briefly that among other aspects of Eastern spirituality, besides the Justinia, that she helped also to make the Jesus prayer better known in the West. Others have as well. But this is 1965, and it wasn't all that familiar at that time, at least in our Catholic tradition. As a practical bridge between East and West, it's probably her writings that will have the widest impact, since this is how most people will come in contact with her mind and heart. But I believe the most profound bridge is the community of Madonna House itself, the incarnation of her many charisms. At the turn of the century in Russia, the burning question was, how is society to be organized? The country was on the threshold of some new beginning, and everybody had a theory. Unfortunately, the communist theory won out. But all her life, Catherine had been pondering this question: how is society to be organized? And the little community of Madonna House is her faith answer. It's a unique blend of East and West, both in its expression and in the hearts of the members. I don't know if most of us can tell anymore the difference between the Eastern and Western elements in our hearts. I don't think I can anymore, because we have tried to imbibe the richness of both of these traditions. Benedict XVI called for creative minorities in the church. Madonna House is one of these creative minorities. It presents a vision together. It presents a vision of life together that people can experience and then take with them into their own vocations. And among other things, that's an expression of this two dimensions of the church's life. As a postulator for Catherine's cause, I try not only to spread her teachings, but I try to situate her in the life of the church's history and spirituality. Until recently, I focused on her place in the Church of North America. Historians, for example, are seeing her as one of the pioneers in interracial justice in the United States. And her cause is one of many in North America. And I do think that her book, Christinia, has given her a lasting place in the prayer movements of the 20th and 21st centuries, indeed, in the church's whole tradition of prayer. Also, Madonna House is one of the earliest of what the church is calling ecclesial communities. Thus, as a founder, she has a place in these new movements. And especially as regards the East-West dimension we are considering, I don't know of any other founder of one of these new communities who has had such a background as Catherine, coming from an Orthodox, really medieval world and living most of her adult life in the West. In other words, she came from what we would call almost a medieval society. It really was a total Christian world. Of course, they weren't living the gospel as well as they should. That was one of the problems. But I mean, the religious culture was there, the processions and the churches and the monasteries. Unimaginable for us to imagine such a situation. So her background has also been a factor in her ability to create a Christian culture in the community of Madonna House. And I believe that that's really the culmination of her gifts. It's the answer to how is society to be organized. And this profound Catholic community with open to all these different traditions is her answer. Now, I mentioned earlier this Russian religious renaissance. Maybe some of you are not familiar, but I'm sure some of the fathers and the students are. It's the title of a book by Nicholas Zernov, wherein he describes the expulsion from Russia of some of the best theological and philosophical minds of Russia at the turn of the century, Berdayev and Frank Bulgakov, and many others. After their exile, a number of them helped to establish the St. Sergius Institute in Paris, where Alexander Schmemann, Bayendorf were educated. And as, again, some of you know, they helped to bring the Russian heritage to America. But now, this is the interesting point, scholars are saying that the real development of Russian thought in the modern world developed outside of Russia and not inside of Russia because of the revolution. They expelled some of their greatest minds. And Father Taft commented on this. He also thought that Russian Orthodoxy flourished and achieved more of its real authenticity in the West when it was free of the former's aberrations. As far as I know, this Russian religious renaissance, it always refers to academic theologians and philosophers. They were teachers, writers in this St. Sergius. But my, I think, kind of new perspective on this Renaissance would be that Russians also in the area of spirituality, like Archimandrite Sophrony, who I had the privilege of meeting in England, Starost Silouan, Mount Athos, the great Saint Maria Skopsova, just canonized recently. Actually, a friend of our community is writing a book comparing Mother Maria's, Saint Maria's spirituality with Catherine's. Archbishop Anthony Bloom. But these people also should be considered part of this, what's called the Russian religious renaissance. Not just the academics, but those who, by their spiritual lives, monastic lives, they also contributed to this growth of the Russian spirituality outside of the country. And may I venture to add Catherine to this illustrious company? The Russian religious renaissance is not simply a renaissance of academic theology and philosophy, but it's a renaissance of spirituality as well. I wish to mention here briefly the great Father Alexander Mann. Some of you may be familiar with him. He was murdered in Russia in 1990, precisely because he was too open to some of the modern developments, good developments, too open to Catholicism and the best of the Russian tradition. One thing that especially endears him to me, not of course the most important thing, is that he translated some of Chesterton's Father Brown's stories. I had to throw that in. But a further dimension I would add is that this cultural phenomenon is not so much a renaissance, which connotes a rebirth of something, but it is a genuine flowering, a birth of some new creation in these fields of theology and philosophy and spirituality. In other words, I would not call Catherine's spirituality a renaissance, but a new flowering, a new expression of Russian spirituality. Thus, I would like to situate Catherine in this wider Russian flowering and not simply see her as part of the North American spiritual landscape. I have read, and I just want to mention this, is what the lesson I want to draw from it. I have read all the English translations of the works of the great Sergius Bulgakov, probably the most outstanding member of the Russian religious renaissance. It is my opinion, and that of others, that he is the greatest Russian theologian of our time, perhaps of all time. And he became so because his natural gifts were freed, released from the restraints of Russia. His spirit in the West was now free. He had access to the whole Western tradition. An indication of how he transcended some of the defects of Russian Orthodoxy is the fact that he became very involved in the Christian ecumenical movement in the World Council of Churches in its early stages. And I simply wish to apply this dynamic to Catherine without trying to evaluate her contribution. History will tell. But like Bulgakov and many Russians, her great spirit was finally free and came into contact with the whole of the Christian tradition. In this new freedom and atmosphere, she breathed forth on the world from her two lungs a marvelous new expression of spirituality. and again to repeat the best expression of what a good bridge she is between East and West is the Madonna House community itself. It's understandable that sometimes when people first come into our community or one of our houses, they ask, are you Eastern or Western? Because both cultures are very visible. The icons and the statues, the Mass and the Byzantine liturgy, books on Eastern spirituality along with the Western. Catherine's main teaching was that we first have to understand the Eastern dimension, and then ask the Holy Spirit how to live it out in our own Western world. As I said at the beginning, achieving these two lugs is probably not a great concern or interest on the part of most Catholics or Orthodox, Westerns or Eastern. But should the personal desire ever arise, or we are looking for teaching materials, Catherine would be a good guide for people who become interested in this aspect of their Christian lives. The best of Russian spirituality is very integrated, very incarnational. And Catherine brought this integrated spirituality to the West and applied it to the whole of life. So please keep her cause for canonization in your prayers. I asked Father Taft what he thought about her cause for canonization. He said, good, go with it. If you present her Russianness in the document you present to the congregation, that will be sufficient to see her as a Russian. Catherine is a breath of fresh air. He also said, I don't know if she was of heroic sanctity, that's for the church to decide, but she was of heroic humanity. And that's good enough for me. I asked Father Taft, is Catherine a bridge between the East and the West? He said, mostly to the West. The East is not really interested in Western spirituality. The popularity of the book Bustinia in the West proves his point. In one of her letters to the community, Catherine noted, quote, in 1937, I met Cardinal Tisserand, who was in charge of Eastern rites in communion with Rome, and who urged me to pray much and never let go of this apostolate. For he said it was for this reason, in part, that God sent me to America, that is her apostolate for unity. In this same letter, Catherine wrote, who will bring the East and its spirituality after my death? Well, in this context, I'd like to thank the Sheptytsky Institute and Father Alex especially for the opportunity to give this talk. By our increased relationship, you're helping us to understand more deeply this dimension of Catherine's charism. I'm very grateful for our increased relationship. As a community, we are trying. We have a house in Russia. And one of our Russian friends said that of all the Western religious communities they were exposed to, only Madonna House members think like Russians. I don't know exactly what that means, but that's quite a compliment. So I believe Catherine will be canonized someday. It will then be seen what a splendid bridge she is between the East and the West. Thanks again for your coming this evening.
We have a few minutes, a few brief minutes. If there are any quick questions, we're going to have some coffee after, so if you have more exegetical questions, you can perhaps talk with Father Robert over our coffee. So, just feel free to maybe stand up.
Not only questions, but comments you may have. And so I don't forget, Maureen Ward here has videotaped this talk, and it will be available on the internet. And we have some cards up here. I'll put them out where shortly you will be able to hear the talk and do So maybe you have either questions or comments, anything that was brought up? Yes.
Thank you for an absolutely fantastic lecture. You mentioned Mother Maria Skoptsova. Is there any indication that they had any contact, either
No, they
person,
have
nothing, and not even written contact?
No, I don't. I have never seen anything. No.
And,
But their spirituality is very similar.
and any contact with Lev Gillet, you know, a monk of the
Yes, I
Eastern Church?
know. But no, Catherine
Nothing,
didn't.
not even letters?
She met some of the people. She met Berdyaev briefly in Paris. As far as I know, she's the only one of that crowd that she met. Yes,
When you were speaking about Russian Renaissance, I couldn't help think about the Hilarion in Russia and Putin and the revival of the Russian Orthodox Church, but it's kind of scary link with Putin and this rise of a nationalism that you had mentioned earlier as one of the problems that have been identified. Do you have any thoughts on that?
if Father Michael and I were talking earlier this evening, I don't know if any of you have ever read Schmemann's diaries that were published after his death by his wife. And he was fairly critical of things Orthodox. And one of the things he mentioned was he thinks that too many of the modern young Russian theologians are reactionary. They're not open, like these guys who left Russia and were at St. Sergius. That breadth of vision that they acquired, he said, is really lacking. And so, like the guy I quoted commenting on Justinia and what's happening in Russia today is not anywhere near the best of the Russian tradition. And to me, I don't speak Russian or anything, but the great sadness is they have almost rejected people like Bulgakov and Soloviev and some of these greatest Russians who ever thought in Russian. They've rejected them, and they're not part of what's happening today. To me, that's a great sadness. That sometimes I ask people, Russians, they visit with us, not that they should know, I said, did you ever hear of Vladimir Soloviev? No. The woman who translated this book into Russian, good friend of ours, I asked her once, did you ever hear of Vladimir Soloviev? She said no. But that's really a great sadness that they're the greatest minds they've ever had. Just rejected them. Yes, Fred?
Father Bob, I'd like to offer a comment here, and it comes from my experience from the 3 trips I took to Russia. And I would disagree that there isn't an interest in the West, in Russia right now. I feel that Catherine, especially, as you mentioned, all of those in the Western Church, she offers something refreshing to them. And I believe it has something to do with a new orthodoxy. There's this way in which people are trying to get beyond the institutional churches, both in the East and in the West. Of course, in the institutional church of the East that had its connections with communism. And I couldn't believe how hungry they were for this gospel without compromise spirituality that Catherine had, that went beyond the 2 lungs, to a new place, to the heart at the center of the lungs, which was the gospel itself, the Spirit of Christ itself. They saw Catherine's Franciscan spirituality as being core to that, and they saw that connected to Seraphim of Seraph as something of this new synthesis between the 2 lungs, as this new heart of orthodoxy, which had to do with dying to self and love, 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 never counting the cost. This radical response to the gospel. They loved the new mandate, the little mandate of Catherine, because they saw it so clearly as a woman who was simply trying to live out the gospel without compromise and without the trappings of an institutional church. And I can tell you they were just on fire when they discovered Dearly Beloved. When they began reading the reflections of Catherine to the community, they thought, where else can we find a teaching of how Christians should live together in community as church in the modern world? And so there was this wonderful way in which I discovered so many Russians that were hungry for what Catherine had to offer, which came from the West, but brought them to this middle place of the lungs, which is the heart of a new orthodoxy and the very spirit of the gospel we visited.
Thank you.
I'll hear, Father.
Thank you, Father.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, what do you see as Catherine's, you've spoken a lot about Catherine's bringing East to the West, and specifically her Roman Catholic or Latin Catholic audience. How was she received, and how do you think she is being received or can be received by Protestants, specifically evangelicals, for whom perhaps even the very terminology, the Catholic terminology in which she framed Orthodox spirituality may come across as alien? And I'm just wondering, from your long experience of the community, do you find that it speaks to evangelicals who connect with her love of Christ, perhaps, but can't immediately wrap themselves mind around the liturgical, sacramental, devotional, the pietistic language? I'm reading Molokani myself right now, and sometimes she gets in this very rhapsodic, vein where I think, I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I know if I had read this even 20 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to plow through it, And I know there's something good there, but it's taken a long time for me, being Catholic, and to even be able to follow her to the thread. You know what I mean? So how do you see her legacy?
Well, I would say her books are very popular among people of all traditions,
Yeah.
Protestants as well. I have men, clergy coming to the priest guest house around reading. They're Protestant clergy reading Christinia and her books. So I think, as Fred said so beautifully, she appeals to the heart. And I guess you're familiar with this new label, Evangelical Catholicism, and George Weigel's book. Anyways, I think she's very evangelical. She talks about Christ, and not so much about the church. But her message is about, what we call falling in love with Jesus. And every real Christian can relate to that teaching. She talks about silence. And as you know, many of our Protestant brothers and sisters, they kind of put aside any kind of monasticism or retreats, all those things. And she's helping them to rediscover some of the roots of the more ancient Christian tradition. So I would say that her books are quite popular among people in a variety of churches, for sure. Because she talks about the Lord mostly, falling in love with God. That's her main message.
Father, I just wanted to really thank you for coming out and for sharing your wisdom, your experience, and your friendship with Catherine with us. Certainly, I speak for all of us that it was a very inspiring talk. And please don't be a stranger. Come back again.
Thank you.